So, this is for educational purposes only and trigger warning, sexual content with mentions of SA. Okay. Now, remember, I told you that I was reading the book, The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Sublette. Remember that? It's been a minute since we've talked about that book, but remember I was reading that book. Now, let's tie that in with our discussion on slave breeding after the transatlantic slave trade was banned in 1808. Remember, we discussed that the domestic slave trade began in 1760, but it accelerated with the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So, how was the domestic slave trade sustained? Slave breeding. Now, we discussed this last year, right? Slave breeding was the practice in slave states of the United States of slave owners to systematically force the reproduction of slaves to increase their profits. Let's revisit that discussion. Now, Virginia led the way in slave breeding as they led the way in selling enslaved people to the Deep South. To add to the supply of slaves, slaveholders looked at the fertility of slave women as part of their productivity and intermittently forced Black women to have large numbers of children. Slave owners often bred their slaves to produce more workers, and the functions of such breeding farms was to produce as many slaves as possible for the sale and distribution throughout the South in order to meet its needs. Now, yes, you heard me correctly. I said breeding farms. Two of the largest breeding farms were located in Richmond, Virginia, and Maryland Eastern Shore, the two states that sold the most enslaved people. Slaveholders actively encouraged their enslaved property people to reproduce by cajoling, threatening, and coercing them into intimate relationships. Enslavers then either sold or exploited the children born of these sexual relationships for labor, earning themselves a profit. Systemic breeding of slaves often forced familial coupling among slave families. Slaves were given hoods or bags over their heads to keep them from knowing who they were engaging with. It could be someone they know, perhaps a niece, aunt, sister, or their own mother. The breeders only wanted a child that could be sold. Historian E. Franklin Frazier, in his book The Negro Family, stated that there were masters who, without any regard for the preferences of their enslaved people, mated their human chattel as they did their stock. Young Black women were often advertised for sale as good breeding stock. To encourage childbearing, owners promised women their freedom after they had produced, say, 15 children. One slave owner from Virginia boasted that his successful breeding policies enabled him to sell 6,000 enslaved children a year. At auction, potential buyers saw potential in fertile women and valued those that produced lots of children as they were producing the workforce with their natural increase, and thus increasing the number of slaves that could be sold or exploited through labor. The value of these women at auction varied depending on whether enslavers viewed them with the intent to exploit their future increase. So, Charles Bell, an enslaved man from Maryland, commented on a slave market that sold pregnant slaves. Yes, that was a thing. He says, The stranger, who was a thin, weather-beaten, sunburned figure, then said he wanted a couple of breeding wenches and would give as much for them as they would bring in Georgia. He then walked along our line as we stood chained together and looked at the whole of us. Then, turning to the women, asked the prices of the two pregnant ones. Our master replied that these were two of his best breeding wenches in all Maryland, that one was 21 and the other only 19, that the first was already the mother of 7 children and the other of 4, that he had himself seen the children at the time he bought their mothers, and that such wenches would be cheap at $1,000 each, but as they were not able to keep up with the gang, he would take $1,200 for the two. $1,200 for 2 pregnant women. Enslaved women had no right to their bodies, no right to their children, no right to their wombs, and no right to refuse forced breeding.